Power shifts in the 19th century. Eastern Europe and Asia fall behind the West. Russia, China, and Japan. Lecture terms. 19th century Russia. Repression and radicalization equals weakness on the world stage. We're going to talk today about the impact that the power shifts, imbalance of power issues have on Eastern Europe as well as Asia. Things will be quite different there than we saw happen in Western Europe. So where are we in Russia in the 19th century? We're still under the imperial system. The Russian Empire was still in place. They controlled a huge amount of territory across northeastern Europe and pushed all the way into Asia. But the Russian Empire was under pressure by the time we get to the 19th century. Russia was a massive multicultural empire, a polyglot empire, like I mentioned other empires like Austria were. But there was not really any unity in place in this empire. The Romanov Tsars that ruled since the 17th century ruled in an autocratic manner. Nicholas I is a prime example of that. He reigns from 1825 to 1855, and he was known as the gendarme of Europe because of his oppressive policies in Russia. Ultimately, the powerful class of nobles were exempt from taxation under the Romanov system. The military was completely under the control of the Tsar, and many of the commoners in Russian society were still under the feudal system. There was still exploitative serfdom in the Russian Empire. There was no real middle class either. So the ideals of classical liberalism and nationalism found it difficult to permeate Russian society, since it was normally the middle class that was the funnel for those kind of ideas being delivered to the regular common population in nations. Without a middle class, it was going to be difficult for any kind of revolution, whether it be an ideological revolution of classical liberalism or an actual revolution with violence, to take place in Russia. The Tsars were able to maintain their authoritarian position, but they were starting to see some pressure by the middle of the 19th century. In the mid-1800s, Russia, like many other nations, attempts to shift the balance of power more in their favor by seizing territory. And this will result in the Crimean War between 1853 and 1856. This was a war that was begun by Tsar Nicholas I, but he dies in 1855, and it's inherited by his son, Alexander II. The Crimean War ultimately was about Russia's attempt to expand control over a weakening Ottoman Empire. And they do this by invading the Crimea, oddly enough, similar to what has been going on now in the 21st century. When the Russians invade the Crimea, this, of course, makes many other nations take notice of what's going on, because the Crimea is an important territory in the Black Sea, and a lot of trade goes through the Black Sea. It's also a very important place when it comes to military maneuvers, naval maneuvers. And so with Russia seizing control of the Crimea, this threatened to upset the balance of power in Europe. And this is when members of the Concert of Europe come in to try to stop Russia. Russia ultimately will be driven back from the Crimea in a humiliating defeat. Not that the Ottoman Empire could do this by themselves, but the British and the French both come to the aid of the Ottoman Empire in order to make sure the balance of power does not shift too far in favor of the Russians. The Russians are always in need of warm water ports. If they gain control over the Crimea, it will give them access to those warm water ports, and they could use that eventually to either dominate the Black Sea through naval domination, or perhaps start to participate in more of the trade in that region that might, of course, force others out of the region. So, Russia will be driven back from the Crimea in the humiliating defeat when the British and the French come to the aid of the Ottoman Empire. And this shows that Russia was really militarily weak on the as a nation on the world stage. Russia had not industrialized. France and Great Britain had by this point. And so they were able to use their industrial technology to develop new weapons that they could use against the Russians, and the Russians ultimately were not able to defend themselves against the firepower of the West. This shows weakness of the Russians on the world stage when they are forced out of the Crimean Peninsula. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the Crimean War begins as a pet project of Tsar Nicholas I, but he dies in 1855, and his son, Tsar Alexander II, inherits this problem. By the time he comes to power, he recognizes that there is no way that Russia can win against the combined forces of France, Great Britain, and the Ottoman Empire. And ultimately, it will be Tsar Alexander II that agrees to a peace treaty and removes the Russian forces from the Crimea. Tsar Alexander II is sometimes seen as a reformer. He recognized that the problems that Russia had in trying to take the Crimean Peninsula ultimately were because Russia had not adequately modernized. They had not industrialized, they had not become westernized like the great hope of many of the previous czars had been during the 17th century. But he recognizes now that if Russia is going to compete on the world stage, they're going to have to westernize. They're going to have to modernize. They're going to have to become more like the West if they are going to compete with the West. And so he reigns from 1855 to 1881 as this Tsar reformer. In 1861, he emancipates the serfs. He ends serfdom in Russia. And this was a good intention of his. But unfortunately, he did not really put into place anything to alleviate the land desires of the peasants that he frees. And ultimately, most of them end up working on the same lands that they had worked on for the masters before, the landowners. But now they will work as wage earners instead of as serfs. They did not find themselves in any great position. So, emancipating the serfs in 1861 without alleviating the poverty and the land hunger in the region did not result in a lot of reforms for the Russian peasantry. The limited attempts to reform administration in the government of Russia also do not really provide any relief for the Russians. Tsar Alexander II was willing to try to work towards a more limited kind of government, perhaps working towards creating a constitutional monarchy instead of an authoritarian or absolute monarchy as Russia had always had before. He was very much indoctrinated in the ideals of the Enlightenment, and he believed, especially after seeing how badly Russia fared in the Crimean War, that that was the only way Russia was going to be able to compete on the world stage. So ultimately, he believed that by starting with small-scale representative governments in local areas, he could eventually usher in a period of forming a constitutional monarchy in Russia. A network of elected district assemblies called Zemstvos was put in place, but ultimately these local governing structures do not usher in a period of creating a national legislature as he had hoped. The Russian landowners very much oppose the idea of creating more representative government because they are concerned that their privileges that they had under the imperialist system would disappear. Tsar Alexander II also, however, tries to force reforms in the economy of Russia by trying to force Russia to finally industrialize. Russia starts this process towards industrialization at the end of the 19th century. They are latecomers to the game. They are trying to play catch-up. And it begins with the VIT system. In 1892 to 1903, the VIT system in Russia will eventually lead to the beginnings of railroad construction throughout Russia. This will be the Trans-Siberian Railroad. But there was massive discontent over this building process. Peasants were uprooted from their rural lifestyle to work for low wages and long hours on the building of the railroads. And eventually, rebellions began against industrialization. The peasants view this industrialization, this modernization, as putting them in a worse predicament than they had been in even under the feudal system, under serfdom. So they start to rebel against Alexander and his policies as a result. So Alexander is in a very bad position. The nobles aren't happy with him trying to bring about some reforms in the government, creating representative local governments. The peasants aren't pleased with him because of this Trans-Siberian Railroad issue. So eventually all of this leads to some real problems for Alexander II. Tsar Alexander II's attempts at reform ultimately lead to repression and radicalization in Russia. Repression of the small middle class that began to grow because of the VIT system being put in place, the beginning of industrialization. Eventually, this middle class will be indoctrinated into more of the radical ideas for social change that we saw going on in Western Europe. The Tsarist authorities are forced to turn to censorship to try to squash this movement. They hoped that they would be able to promote more constitutional government, but ultimately by doing that they allowed for even more radical ideas to come into Russia. And so eventually a secret police force is put in place and many of the radicals are uprooted and sent to Siberia. The nationalist sentiments that were seething in the imperial territories also caused the Tsar to not be able to make any progress, because the Russian nationalists were primarily those that were pro-authoritarian government and pro-absolute monarchy. And so eventually this reforming Tsar of Alexander II is not really able to make any real progress towards reform in Russia. This will eventually give way to even more radicalization to happen in Russia. And poor Alexander II, with his good intentions, ultimately ends up in a bad situation. In 1881, a radical anarchist group known as the People's Will, they assassinate Tsar Alexander II. And when they do this, this will lead the following czars after Alexander to react in a knee-jerk kind of way. They will increase repression. Industrialization will slow as a result. They see what happened to Alexander II as an example of what happens when you attempt to reform things in Russia. And so they eventually take a complete 180 to that reform process and go back to being more like Nicholas I, an authoritarian ruler. The following czars will eventually return Russia to this oppressive government. And Nicholas II, who is not the following czar, but the grandson of Alexander II, ultimately will be the last of the Romanov czars. He reigns from 1894 to 1917. He ends up going to war with Japan, the Russo-Japanese War between 1904 and 1905. And since Russia still had not fully industrialized, since industrialization had slowed after the death of Alexander II, it will also be a humiliating defeat, which exposes government weaknesses in Russia. This will lead to social discontent in Russia in 1905. And this will eventually lead to the coming Russian Revolution, communist revolution that will happen as we approach 1917 after World War I is over. We'll talk more specifically about what happens under the governance of Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, and the move towards the Russian Revolution in a later lecture. Now we will move further east into Asia. 19th century China, the fall of the Manchus in the Qing dynasty, and the increase of foreign influence in China leads to the loss of sovereignty. The last time we talked about China, we talked about how the Qing dynasty was established by the Manchus, and how ultimately it led to a rise in population and an increase in the economy in China, and a lot of good things resulted from the Qing power. But eventually we will see that the Qing tried to attempt to restrict foreign influence in their country. And by doing that, they attempt to control which countries will do trade with China. China felt that they had the luxury items that many nations wanted, so they should have more of a say in how those luxury items, like silks, were traded. The Qing dynasty attempted to restrict the British involvement in trade in China, worrying about the British trying to take control over China as they had done in other places in Asia, namely in India. The attempt to restrict the British will eventually lead to the Opium Wars between 1839 and 1842 in China. Since 1759, European commercial presence in China was limited by the Qing emperors. They wanted to make sure that the trade that happened in China was to the benefit of China completely. So they, like other absolute monarchs, trying to use mercantilist policies, attempted to restrict which merchants were able to trade in China. They also forced the foreign merchants to deal solely with licensed Chinese merchants. And also, they were only to do trade in the currency of silver bullion. This meant that the government specifically designated which merchants could be traded with, and ultimately the only trade could be done with silver. This limited the amount of trade that could happen with foreign nations. But they felt that it would protect the Chinese interests because the trade that would happen would ultimately be for the benefit of China. That's how mercantilism works. The British East India Company, however, decided that they could skirt around this issue because they became heavily involved in the trade of opium. And ultimately, they decide to use this very powerful drug that they harvest in their colony of India to their advantage. They start to smuggle opium on the black market into China, and they get the Chinese hooked on opium. This allowed for more and more silver to go out of China and into British hands. The British would smuggle the opium in, they would trade it with dealers in China in exchange for silver bullion. Then they could take that silver bullion and use it to trade with the licensed Chinese merchants for other goods. Ultimately, the British were the ones coming out overwhelmingly on top. They were getting the silver from the Chinese and then giving the silver back to the Chinese merchants for the luxury items, ultimately almost getting the items for free as a result. It was a brilliant strategy for the British, but it of course was to the detriment of Chinese society. Opium was very, very addictive, and it caused a great deal of problems in Chinese society. Ultimately, this will lead to warfare between the Chinese and the British, because the Chinese moved to enforce a ban on the opium trade by the late 1830s, recognizing the social ills that were coming about in China as a result of the opium trade. And this makes the British traders very angry. And so ultimately they appeal to the British government to send the military into China in order to force the Chinese ports to open to any trade, any foreign trade, with any kind of bullion being used or what have you. This will lead to the wars. The Opium Wars began in 1839 and will continue until 1842. Ultimately, this will mean that the British were able to force open the Chinese ports. The Chinese, the Qing, were ultimately forced to sign treaties to allow British trade to happen on whatever terms the British wanted. The Chinese armies were not able to effectively defend themselves against the British Navy, and the British naval forces easily defeat the Chinese. The Opium Wars result in a series of unequal treaties between foreign powers and China. China was forced to sign these treaties. They were not able to defend themselves against the foreign influences, militarily or economically. And ultimately they were forced to accept these disadvantageous treaties that they call the unequal treaties after the Treaty of Nanjing was signed in 1842 that ended the Opium Wars. In this treaty, Hong Kong, which was the most lucrative port for China, was ceded to the British, and they would be in control of Hong Kong until the year 2000. Other ports were also opened to British traders, and this opened the door for other European powers, as well as other Asian powers, Japan in particular, to conclude similar treaties with China, similar unequal treaties with China. The Qing dynasty ultimately loses most of the tributary states that they had gained control over early on in the Qing dynasty. They lose these territories to the Europeans and the Japanese. And China itself is divided into spheres of influence by 1895. The Qing dynasty will lose a great deal of control over the economy in China as a result. Even though they still technically have control over the government in China, they lose a great deal of the economic control, and that will lead to more weakness for China on the world stage. In addition to the external problems that the Qing dynasty was having with other nations, resulting in the unequal treaties after the Opium Wars, we also note that the Qing dynasty were suffering internal problems as well. The population had risen 50% between 1800 and 1900, but the land under cultivation remained static, and not enough food was being produced to feed the large population. This will eventually lead to large-scale rebellions later in the 19th century over the discontent of the Chinese peasantry towards this poverty. The result is a number of rebellions against the Qing. Probably the largest of these rebellions was the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864. It was led by a schoolteacher who, among other things, called for the destruction of the Qing dynasty. The Taiping rebels advocated a lot of the ideas that we see advocated by socialists in Western Europe. The abolition of private property, creation of communal wealth, free public education, mass literacy, etc. But ultimately, after some initial victories, they will ultimately lose control, and by the end of the rebellion, about 100,000 of the Taiping rebels were massacred by the Qing forces. However, that will not end the problems. There will be others that will come in and cause problems for the Qing as well. One of the attempts to make things better in the Qing dynasty happens right after the Taiping Rebellion is over. It's called the Self-Strengthening Movement between 1860 and 1895. It was a response to the Taiping Rebellion defeat. And it was an attempt of some of the leadership in the Qing dynasty to blend Chinese cultural traditions with European industrial technology. Some of the Qing leaders recognized the need for China to westernize or modernize if they were going to compete with the West. And, of course, this was even more evident after the signing of the unequal treaties. This change to the Chinese economy and society, however, would only be superficial with the self-strengthening movement, and it will lead to more tensions internally in China. Even though the Taiping Rebellion, with their socialist attempts at reforms, were put down by the Qing, this opened the door for other reform movements to be pushed in China. In 1898, the 100-Day Reform Movement takes place, and the leaders of this movement interpreted Confucianism in a way that would allow for radical changes to the system. They were pro-industrialization, pro-westernization. They were more like classical liberals and wanted a more, I guess you would say, equal type of government, not a socialist economic system, but more of a free market system. And the emperor at the time, Gangzhou, attempted to go along with the 100-Day Reform movements. He agreed that these were good, but he was still under the sway of the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had ruled as his regent until he came of age to govern himself. And the Empress Dowager Cixi did not appreciate the attempts at westernization in China. And so she ultimately steps in and overpowers Emperor Guangxu and nullifies the reforms and imprisons him. Then she sponsors a rebellion of her own with the pro-conservative forces. It's called the Boxer Rebellion of 1899. And what this is where the Empress Dowager Cixi, who lived from 1835 to 1908, supports a society, a conservative society known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. That's why we call it the Boxer. We call them the Boxers. They were pro-Chinese, pro-Chinese traditionalist ways. They did not like trying to change Chinese society by westernizing it. They were anti-foreign influence in China. And the Boxer Rebellion attempted to rid China of what they called the, quote, foreign devils and their influences in Chinese society. Empress Dowager Cixi preaches to the Boxers that they are doing the will of heaven by doing this, and she misleads them to believe that the European weapons could not harm them, that they had some kind of superpower where the European weapons could not do them harm. This, of course, results in about 140,000 Boxers besieging European embassies in 1900, and they were completely crushed. A coalition of European forces steps in and crushes the Boxers. And as you see here, a great number of skulls are at the foot of this Chinese man, showing you the massive amounts of people who were killed in the process. China once again is forced to accept the stationing of foreign troops and foreign influences in their territories. The Boxer Rebellion fails. There will be even more decline after the failed Boxer Rebellion. The imprisoned emperor dies a mysterious and sudden death. But Gigi herself, the Empress Dowager, dies a day later in November of 1908. And the only person left in line for the throne is the 2-year-old Pui, who is placed on the throne, with of course another regent put in place to try to help him govern. Because he is 2, because it is seen that the royal line is weak, this will eventually lead to a massive revolution in China against the imperial government in 1911. And Pui himself will abdicate in 1912. We'll talk more about the revolution in China in 1911 as we move forward in a different lecture. So now what's going on in Japan in the 19th century? Well, again, nationalism will have an impact here, and we will see the ousting of the Tokugawa shogunate, and ultimately a, quote, restoration of true imperial power with what is known as the Meiji Restoration. Japanese society is in turmoil in the early 19th century. By the time we get to the early 19th century, there was poor agricultural output throughout Japan. This resulted in famines and increasingly high taxes being forced upon the population. This led to the decline of the nobility, the daimyo, and the samurai classes, and peasants also start to starve, which will lead to peasant rebellions throughout Japan. The Tokugawa government attempted reforms between 1841 and 1843 to deal with this economic problem. They tried, first of all, to cancel debts. The daimyo and the samurai who had become indebted as the landowners in Japan, their debts were canceled to try to force them to perhaps start to cultivate once again. Merchant guilds were abolished by the Tokugawa shoguns, and peasants were compelled to return to cultivating rice for low wages, since now the daimyo and samurai who owned the lands no longer had to worry about paying those debts back to the government. They hoped that now this would mean that the peasants would go back to work because the daimyo could pay them, and it would eventually result in a resurgence of the economy. The reforms, however, were very ineffective. Making matters worse to the economic situation, add foreign pressures taking place in Japan. Needless to say, Europeans and Americans were both attempting to establish relations in Asia through trade. We saw it already with China, and now we're going to see it with Japan. The U.S. in particular were looking for Pacific ports for their whalers as well as their merchants to do business. For a great number of generations, the Japanese had only allowed Dutch presence in Nagasaki and in other major port cities. In 1853, however, Matthew Perry sells a gunship up to Edo, Tokyo, and forces the Japanese to open the port to the west. This sparks a conservative Japanese reaction against the Tokugawa shogun because he is seen as ineffective to keep the foreigners out. They begin to rally around the emperor in Kyoto, and this will eventually lead to a restoration of imperial power. But that imperial power will not force the foreigners out. Instead, will take a completely different approach. The conservative reaction against the Tokugawa shoguns ultimately leads to a brief civil war period in Japan between imperial supporters and the Tokugawa forces. Ultimately, this leads to the restoration of true imperial power in 1868, known as the Meiji Restoration. Emperor Mushito, also known as Meiji, who lived from 1852 to 1912, takes power in Japan, or reasserts imperial power, since the emperors were still around before during the Tokugawa shogunate, but they didn't have any real power. He will take power himself. The Tokugawa forces are crushed, but he is not a conservative. Instead, he recognizes that if Japan is going to compete with the West, they need to become more like the West. His goals, of course, are prosperity and strength for Japan. And this will ultimately bring glory to Japan and make Japan a greater nation. He advocates what he calls rich country, strong army. So he resolves himself and Japan to learn Western technology rather than resist it, like the Chinese had done and the Russians had done. Perhaps after seeing what had happened in both Russia and China, the Japanese under the Meiji recognized that if you can't beat them, join them. So by taking a different approach, by embracing westernization and modernization instead of thwarting it, Japan actually becomes more of a Western nation as we move towards the 20th century. The Meiji reforms also will help to usher in a constitutional government. Oddly enough, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the government in Japan was more authoritarian than it would be under the emperor. The Meiji Restoration will usher in constitutional reforms. Bureaucrats that had traveled abroad argued for an adoption of Western legal proceedings and technology. And the Meiji government removes privileges for the nobility, the daimyo and the samurai, and they instead depend upon a conscripted army that replaces the samurai. Samurai rebellion would be crushed by this new national army. Tax reforms would be put in place by the Meiji emperors. Payment in cash was now advocated rather than payment in kind, and that will stabilize the economy of Japan once and for all. The constitutional monarchy actually is underscored and really comes about by 1889 when a true Japanese constitution is promulgated. It is more conservative than the Western counterparts of constitutional monarchy. Only 5% of the male population was allowed to vote in the 1890 election. And Japan will be very slow to advocate the extension of the vote to more people, lowering the property qualifications. So it's more conservative as a constitutional government than many of the ones that we saw in the West. But the economic reforms that were initiated by the Meiji did promote rapid industrialization in Japan. This also improved the economy dramatically. Literacy rates will also improve dramatically during this time period. The government holdings that had been controlled by the Tokugawa would eventually, some of them, be sold to private investors to develop into new businesses, to industrialize certain areas of Japan. They were given government permission and tax breaks in order to develop more industrialization for Japan. And this eventually will lead to more and more growth, industrial growth in Japan. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan looks more like a Western nation than any other Asian territory. If you can't beat the West, become like them. And this ultimately will prove beneficial for Japan. As we move into the 20th century, Japan will become more of a world power than any of their other Asian or even Eastern European counterparts. Thank you.